Okay. So we'll move on from there. So let's look at concurrent ownership, which is on the 3rd page. So do you know what joint tenancy means? What does that mean to you? Okay, I'll explain it to you. Let's say that you and your best friend decide to buy a property, and you have to take title at the same time. You have to take possession at the same time, so you're moving into it. You have interest, which is 50-50 equally. And so if one of you passes away, the survivorship right will go to the person who's surviving, unless you have a will that says otherwise. Okay? So this also, joint tenancy is almost like the concept of matrimonial home, but it can apply to so many other situations. Like you could be living with mom and dad, you could be living with brother, sister, you could be living with best friends, you could be living with people where you have an equal interest in the property, you could be living with your grandma. It could be so many other people that it would apply to. Okay. So now when you look at tenants in common, it means that you have one thing in common, which is just possession. Okay. So tenants in common is pretty interesting. A lot of times when you think of, say you're leasing an apartment with your friend, if somebody were to pass away, the only thing that would be left over is that there would be no survivorship. There's no rights left over. Like you would literally have to sign a new lease at that point.
Okay.
Like you would just have to start fresh, because there's nothing there for you to transfer, because there's not like really an asset there. But tenants in common can apply to other scenarios too. So let's say you lived in a condo and you're allowed to use the swimming pool and the tennis courts. That's where you're actually practicing tenants in common as well. So you don't actually own the pool and the tennis court in a condominium building. You own your unit, but you're a tenant in common that you can use those things. So the only thing there's nothing that passes on. There's no survivorship. Like if that person passes away, they'll sell their condo unit probably to somebody else, and that person will move in, and then they'll become tenants in common with those items again, with the tennis court and the pool once again.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the difference of how you can understand it. Sometimes tenants in common, you can also think of it like, if you were to treat it like an asset, so maybe you would consider some kind of like timeshare where you have a deed and you own a portion of a company, but you only get 1 week to use that, that condo in Florida or whatever it is. So you could consider that like a tenants in common scenario too, because the only thing you have a right to is possession.
Right.
And then everyone else who's there, they're taking title at a different time. They're not taking possession at the same time. They don't have equal interest per se. It all depends what the scenarios are, because they have maintenance fees and other factors. So it's a completely different situation. Okay. So matrimonial homes, what you'll understand is that if you were to buy a home, if there's a couple buying a home, for example, and they have a marriage breakdown, and one of those spouses had acquired property before they got married that was not the matrimonial home, it probably wouldn't fall into the marriage breakdown split for them to split up the property. After you move into a property together and it becomes a matrimonial home, it's got that designation, and it's going to be split and managed by the courts accordingly to those rules. The only exception to situations like that is you sign a prenuptial agreement.
Okay.
So don't ever sign that, okay?
Okay, what does that mean?
Prenuptial agreement is where you basically have agreed in advance that you will not have any claims on any assets in the marriage that belong to the husband or other spouse.
And why would anybody sign that?
Well, some rich people claim that they're getting married for love, so they have their new partner sign if they're like extremely wealthy and they're afraid of losing half their wealth. So they'd have somebody sign a prenuptial.
Okay.
That's why you're never going to sign one, okay?
Right. Okay.
So the other types of ownership is condominium, which we talked about. There's cooperatives. If you think of Bathurst and St. Clair, there's kind of these older 4-unit apartment buildings, and they're actually corporation. And when you buy into the co-op, you own 25% if you buy 1 unit of that corporation, and you have to be voted in by all of the other people that live there. Okay, it's a very old style of ownership. It's not very popular. Banks don't really like it. You have to have 25% down payment minimum to buy it usually, or more. But yeah, not too popular with the banks. So then you've got co-ownership, like say you and your friend own a cottage together. That's a co-ownership. So it's usually 2 or more persons owning a recreational property. So like so it could be you and 3 of your friends that own a cottage together, and then you just share it on weekends. And then there's obviously partnerships where there's a partnership with you and another group of people buying properties for investments or whatever the case is.
And with like co-ownership, does it have to be divided evenly?
Not necessarily, no. You could divide it into different percentages. Because co-ownership is just that you own it together. It doesn't mean you own it equally.
Okay.
So you could own it with like 4 friends, and then you own 30%, somebody else owns 20%, based on your down payments or based on the amount of money you're putting into the deal.
That's true. Okay.
Yep. And then the difference between real estate and real property. So real estate is your tangible aspects of property. And then real property includes both tangible land and improvements, and intangible, which is your rights. So real property can also include your chattels, fixtures, movable property, your personal property, all of it is all there kind of thing.
Okay.
Okay, so your real estate's really your land and maybe the building, but for real property, you're really considering the actual land and improvements and intangible rights as well.
Okay.
So a couple of things. Do you understand the concept of bundle of rights?
No.
So usually applies to fee simple properties and properties that have bundle of rights included, mean that you have the right to sell, you have the right to lease it out, you have the right of way, like an easement maybe, you have surface rights, air rights, mineral rights, and then you have the water rights if it's touching the property. So you're allowed to enjoy the water that's touching the property, but there's also other restrictions on how much water you can take out and use. If it's like a lake or a government body, so you have to have, there's provisions and regulations you have to consider.
Okay, so like, would that be for like example a condo?
That'd be probably a better example as a detached fee simple property, because we're talking about you touching the water and having use of it. We're talking about surface rights and air rights and mineral rights, and you're really going to have that on a detached property versus a condo. Okay.
Okay.
And then we talk about easement and license. So if you have 2 parcels of land that are beside the water, and one of the parcels of land has to cross over one property to get to the water, they might get a right of way, but they do have to register it as well.
Okay.
And that would be an easement, so it would be registered. So the person who is providing them access, the property in the middle before the water, that's known as a servient tenement. And then the one who's taking use of that easement is known as the dominant tenement.
Can you give me an example?
Okay, so you got, let's say, think of A, B, and C, right? So A needs to cross over B to get to C, which is the water. C is the water.
Okay.
Alrighty? So A property has to cross through B to get to C to reach the water. That little path that they're using to cross over B, that's a right of way. That's an easement. Because
Like a boat?
no, it could be just like a pathway, it could be a walkway, it could be like a gravel road or a gravel pathway. It's just something that they have to use to cross over to get to the water, because property B is blocking property A from the water. They can't get to it unless they cross over property B. So it's kind of a situation where you have to cross over because there's no other way around it.
Okay. Yep.
So it's like smack dab in the middle, like a sandwich.
Yes.
Okay?
Okay.
And then there's something called a license, which is, let's say that you are in property A, you have to cross property B to get to C to build a bridge, and it's only for 30 days, then you would have a license and not an easement. So you could be a contractor crossing over like somebody's property for 30 days to build something or to fix something. That would be a license. And that would not be an easement. Easement is more for like an extremely long time permanent situation.
But
So
is it normally like over water, or is that just an example like giving me?
that's a really good example for you to remember it by, because you'll see a lot of easements on properties of cottages where one property is blocking access to the water, So
Okay.
the other property has to literally cross their property to get to the water.
Right. Okay.
Okay. All right. So the only ownership restrictions you have are by the government usually. So regulation is the police, so you can't do illegal stuff on your property. Otherwise, you're going to be regulated and you're going to have limited ownership, right? Or limited activities you can do even being an owner. So expropriate is when the land is taken by the government. So the government will give you fair market value for your property if they have to build a highway through your land.
Okay.
Or something like that. And then obviously if you don't pay your taxes, you're limited to your ownership because they'll take it away. And then you have a sheet, which is return property to the government if there's no owner found. So if you have a person who is like a loner, and they don't have any family, they don't have any friends, and they take off and they leave a property behind that can't be claimed, the government will actually have to take it over if nobody will come and claim it.
Okay.
And then you have eminent domain, which is the city saying, hey, Sarah, we need your huge backyard, a part of it, to continue to build a park. And again, you're usually compensated for that too.
Okay.
And then you got public limitations, like where a builder will put in a restriction when they build, like, say, like a row of townhouses. So a builder will build, like, say, 5 townhouses that are all connected together, and he'll put a rule or a restrictive covenant which allows you to maybe not have any paint colors other than white on the garage and door. So you can do everything else you want inside, but you can't paint the garage any other color except for white. So they could put that restrictive covenant in there.
Okay.
Okay. So that's what a restricted covenant means. So you already understand that. So implied covenant means that you're basically talking about promising to pay the bank the money that you owe them. That's what an implied covenant is. So you promise the bank that you're going to pay them. Also, you're going to also follow some rules within that promise. You're going to promise to keep the property neat. You're going to promise to pay the mortgage charges. You're going to promise to pay the property insurance. And you're also going to promise not to bring claims onto the property. So if you replace the roof, you're promising you're going to pay the roofer and not have him put a claim on the property.
Okay.
Okay? Okay, so then we kind of move into land descriptions. If you think of a country setting property, you're going to look at it more like a lot number, and then a concession number, and then the town it's in, and then the county it's in, when you look at the legal description. But where you live now in the suburbs, you're going to see like plan number 43M, then a lot number, and then the city, because you're part of a subdivision, so you're off a registered plan.
Right.
Okay. So country properties will have a different legal land description, and then the ones in the suburbs will have a different one as well. So the basis of your modern land description starts in 1972. They talk about concessions and townships. So what they first started was single front townships, and that's where you take an acre of land. It's placed most likely by a water source, like a lake or river, and it's 1 acre of land. All of these acres that are running along the water, they're an acre each, and they're talking about 200 acres. So single front township is 200 acres times 1. So each lot is 1 acre running along the water.
Okay.
That's what a single front township is. Now when you think about a double front township, it's 200 acres, but you got a road dividing it in the middle, and then you got half an acre on each side. So look at your street. Okay? You got one house on one side, you have a road, and then you have a house on the other side, right?
Yeah.
So think of your land as half an acre, and the person in front of you is another half acre, and now you've got 200 of those half acres running along that road on either side. So if you do the total, 200 here is 100 acres, and 200 here is 100 acres. That's another 200 acres in total.
Okay.
Just a visual so you have it. Okay, so that's a double front township. A sectional township is like a little town. It's 1,000 acres with dividing roads running inside of it. So take any town that you can think of, like take Bowmanville, Oshawa, whatever. 1,000 acres, and it's divided by multiple roads and lots. Okay?
Okay.
Alrighty. So land measurements are done by the meets and bounds system, and then we'll do that a little bit later. So we'll move into surveys, which is on page 7. So a surveyor's real property report, that's a complete survey report, okay?
Okay.
Now what it has two parts of it to make it a complete report. So what's a plan of a survey? You've seen the drawings, you've seen a lot line, the measurements.
Yeah.
Maybe you've seen like some kind of graph that is outlining the lot size, like what the width is, what the depth is. And then so that's basically the graphical version or the visual impression of the property is a plan of survey. When you have a surveyor certify that piece of paper, so he's got his stamp, his signature, and all of that good stuff is on that piece of paper, it becomes a surveyor's real property report.
Okay.
That's when it becomes like official.
Okay.
So if it's just a drawing, it's actually known kind of like a reference plan. The next version or the next topic is reference plan. There's a huge difference between reference plan and a registered plan. So don't confuse the two.
Yes.
Okay? So the reference plan is essentially just the visual impression, like basically the drawing on the piece of paper. So your plan of survey will be the drawing, and then once it gets certified by a surveyor, it becomes the surveyor's real property report.
Okay.
All right. And so if you are talking about now a registered plan, now we're going to move to not a reference plan, but now a registered plan. So if you were a builder, you buy a big piece of land, you want to make it into a subdivision and build a whole bunch of houses. Okay? So you're gonna draft a plan and take it to the municipality. So you'll take it to the city of Toronto and say, hey, I want to build 50 houses. So you're gonna show your draft plan. They're gonna say, thanks, Sarah. Here's a couple changes you need to make. So once you make those changes, they'll now take it in as a final plan. So once the final plan looks good and it's ready to go, it's going to get registered and become a registered plan. So now it's going to be totally official, and that's going to be the plan the builder is going to follow with no changes unless it's approved.
Okay.
Okay? All right. So I think that's pretty good. And just try to like take in this information, and then of course we can review it later.
Yep.
And then you got severance versus subdivision. So if you have a big piece of land and you decide to divide it into 2 or 3 parts, it'll be known as a severance. The second you decide to divide it into more than 4 parts, it'll become a subdivision, typically.
2 or 3 parts meaning like...
So you have a big piece of land, you divide it into 3 lots instead. And those 3 lots, you sell one to another person, you sell one to the, another buyer, and you keep one for yourself. That's a severance.
Okay, it doesn't have to be like houses or anything.
No, you can just sell the land and say, go build your own house. That's your own problem. You don't have to be involved if you're not a builder. Okay, so that covers the understanding. But typically, the reason why I said typically it's 4 or more, sometimes you'll see like in downtown Toronto, like really small land spaces, and you'll see like these 3 or 4 townhomes, but it's considered a subdivision too.
Okay.
But it's on like one piece of land. Like that's kind of like where you're building multiple properties. So it just depends on like what city we're talking about.
Okay.
Okay. And then we'll just kind of look at road systems. So in Ontario, you have 400 series highways, and then you have other numbers from 2 to 169. You have to keep in mind the King's highways are either 2 to 4 lanes or more. You have to remember something that's important is that when you have a highway that belongs to the King's Highway, it has to have certain permits involved if you want to get exposure to, say, like a building sign, a billboard, a gas station, or any kind of structure that will be along those highways. So when you travel to 400 and you see a gas station on the side, they had to get a special permit to build that gas station on the King's Highway. Okay? So what it means is that even if you reside off a small town that connects to the 401, you can't just hop onto the 401 from any road. You have to take the designated ramps that are like constructed.
Yes.
Okay, so that's all it's kind of referring to.
Okay.
And then there's something called a GIS, which is a software database, very sophisticated, kind of like Google Maps, sort of. It takes all of your survey systems, and then it's compiled onto that system. So it might become, in the future, might become a land description system in the future. It probably will be. It's kind of like Google Maps, but just as sophisticated, like where it just looks really cool. It's got all the information you need, and then it's going to probably become official.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so, and what's your question so far for chapter 1 and 2?
Well, they were the questions at the end of the chapters.
Okay.
If you wanted to go through that with me.
Sure, let's do that.
Chapter 1 wasn't too bad. I didn't get a lot wrong, but chapter 2 was not so great.
All right, well, let's have a look at chapter 2 so we can kind of see what's going on there. So are you referring to the questions in the back of the book?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Should I be doing your question?
Well, you can do those too. You'll have to do those eventually. But let's have a look and see what you're doing in the book in chapter 2, so we can have a little bit of an idea, and just see like where you're having a lot of trouble.
So let's start with 2. Sorry. True and false.
Alright, just give me a second while I find the page I'm looking for.
Actually, I don't really think I need to review that one. Because just memorize it. So maybe 5. Maybe 5, true and false.
Okay. Sorry, just give me a second. I'm just waiting for it to load. My computer's got so much stuff on it. I think what I'll do, I'll open it from another. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it here. It's just taking so long to load for a moment. I don't know why. Alright, chapter 2.
Yes.
True and false?
Yeah, let's do 14. Change my mind again.
14. Is that the direct access by adjacent property owners?
Yes.
Okay. Direct access by adjacent property owners to 400 series in Ontario is permitted, provided that the applicable permits are obtained. What do you think about that?
I have no idea.
Okay,
I thought it was true.
No, it's not, because remember we just talked about it. So if you had direct access by a property that's right on the 400 series, you can't just hop on to the 400 series. And
But
you can't get a permit from it. You have to use the ramps. Remember, we just talked about it.
Oh, I thought it meant like if it was an actual like constricted road.
Yeah. Direct access just means that you have the like you are able to, but you're just not allowed to.
Okay.
Yeah. So most of the 400 series, you'll see that there is no direct access from any property to hop onto it.
Okay.
You know.
Multiple choice.
And what was the other one?
Multiple choice.
Number 2, all of them. For chapter 2.
Number 1.
Okay, for multiple choice. Okay, so exercise 1 is for the purpose of land description. Most of southern Ontario was originally divided into counties. Counties were then divided into rectangles called townships. Townships were in turn divided into strips of land running the entire length of the township. The areas between these strips of land were called what?
I don't think I could find that in my notes.
You can figure out the answer?
I put C.
Concessions?
But that's completely wrong.
Yeah, concessions refer to the strips of land running the entire length of a township. So they already talked about that just before they come to the other part. So when there are strips of land running the entire length of the township, that's a concession.
Yes.
Okay, so lot lines are boundaries of the lot, so that doesn't apply. So lots doesn't apply anyway. They have lot lines and lots, so B, C, and D do not apply anyways. So your answer is actually A, known as road allowances, and that's because each concession is separated by a road allowance. So these road allowances might have not been open, but they remain as public property.
Okay.
Okay, so when you are talking about, they refer to strips of land running the entire length of the township, that's a concession. Then they said the areas between the strips of land were called their road allowances. Because the only thing that's really cutting into concessions, okay? So if this is your township, right? You got a square, and then the whole, like a strip of land that runs this way to the end, that is known as your concession. So when you cut through it, that's a road allowance.
I see.
Okay? And then we'll go to the next one.
The next one. 2.
Okay, it says, which of the following statements are correct? Okay, so the first one says land is described in a precise manner so that one piece of land can't be mistaken for another. Yeah, that sounds about right. A description such as the lot with 2 mature maples or 43 Main Street is not sufficient as a land description in current legal document. That would be right. It's not sufficient to describe land like that. Third one says when originally laid out, county boundaries might follow natural boundaries, example, river or lake, but most often they're straight lines through the bush. So that is correct, because the boundary can keep on going even though it is passing through like a bush or whatever the case is. And then the last point says a concession is normally 66 feet in width. That's not true. I would have told you if that was already in the study notes, if that applied. So that's not correct. So your answer in this one would be B, because the first 3 are correct and the 4th one is wrong.